Of course, you now work for the Tribune Company, a journalistic enterprise, and I guess my question for you is, are there special challenges in working in public relations for a journalistic enterprise whose employees can be suspicious of public relations?
Yes, there are special challenges, and I remember one of the first phone calls I got when I came to work at Tribune Company was from a reporter at the New York Times. And she wanted to know about things that she had heard about that the company was doing and that she intended to report on. And I thought, well, now this is a little odd. I'm here talking to a competitor of my company who's asking me to divulge what otherwise might be looked at as company secrets, initiatives that we might not necessarily want to share. At the same time, you have the challenge of you're representing a company that is doing the same thing every day to other companies. You represent a company where others are asking every day hard questions, expecting to get answers. So there's certainly a bit of a conflict and a conundrum here because, you have to remember that our business is journalism. And so even as we're saying to a reporter from the outside who's trying to do their job, no, we can't talk about that, or we'll decline comment, or we simply won't answer the question. You've got thousands of other reporters working for your company trying to get similar information from other companies on a daily basis. I recognize that. The flip thing to do would be to say, well, that's somebody else's problem. I'm in corporate, so I don't have to worry about that. But it is a bit of a challenge. It's also a challenge for, and in dealing with our own reporters who will call me as a spokesman for the company and want information that I am from time to time not going to be able to give them. Or there may just be times when the company feels that it's not in their interest to comment about a particular issue, topic, whatever it may be. So there are some interesting challenges. When we were a public company, for instance, one of the challenges was always to deal with the reporter, the poor soul who got picked to write the story about executive compensation when Tribune filed its proxy report with the SEC. Because you wanted to make sure that reporter got however they were going to interpret the information. As I would say to them, I don't care. I care that you get the facts right. If you get the facts right, you can interpret it however you want. And I think it's also hard for a reporter. It's hard for a reporter to report on their own company. The easy example is the sports reporters who, at the time when we owned the Cubs, would report about the Cubs. They felt obligated, I'm sure, to bend over backwards to not appear as though they were Homer, a Homer reporter. And I think at times that made them even more critical of the management of the team than they might otherwise have been. But it's a tightrope that you have to walk on I think both sides of the equation.
How, as a public relations professional, do you deal with that?
I try to focus people on the facts. I try to focus people on what they know and what they can determine through good reporting. And don't get me wrong, there are some wonderful news outlets, reporters. There are people doing great work in journalism. But I've also found over the course of now the last 12 years that people are far more willing to report rumor, to report through the use of anonymous sources, to accept something as fact that they've only learned by reading some other publication which is in turn sourced it back to some other publication, which by the time it gets around to me is fourth or fifth hand. And so I think it's made reporters far more competitive and in some respects far lazier than I would have ever expected them to become, because the news cycle is so telescoped that, and the pressure is so great to be first, not necessarily to be right. But if there's a rumor out there that you didn't get that somebody else did get, how am I going to advance the rumor, even though it's still just a rumor? And I'll give you a couple, if you've got the time and inclination, a couple of examples. We have been in Chapter 11 for roughly the last 3.5 years. During the course of that time, various rumors have popped up about new management at our company. At various points during my career, I should have been working either for Michael Eisner, for Jeff Zucker, for a host of hedge funds. And I will get calls from reporters who say, I want to talk to you about Michael Eisner. The biggest one was about 15, 16 months ago, where I want to talk to you about Michael Eisner because my understanding is he's going to be the new CEO of your company within the next 4 weeks. And so in a situation like that, I don't expect the reporter to tell me where on earth he's heard this, but I would like some basis for why he believes that to even be true, and why it's worth a phone call to me to follow up. And inevitably I would find out that was a rumor they heard from somebody who heard it from somebody. And I would try to remind people that, number one, we have a CEO. Number two, we're still in Chapter 11, and we have a board of directors that will remain in place until we come out of Chapter 11, that only a new board of directors will be able to choose a new CEO. And if you look at some of this stuff logically, it doesn't hold up. So it's those types of things, and the willingness of what I would say oftentimes good journalists to report those things or repeat those things never ceases to amaze me. I from time to time deal with the New York Post. It's like dealing with the Wizard of Oz. It's always a flight of fancy, and seldom sourced to anything that's credible. They've run stories where it's just, and the word on the street is, and you want to say, well, how is that credible report? I could go run down to the street and scream out, this is going to happen. And that's apparently in some cases okay to report. So I think all of those factors have created a situation where the bar for the willingness of people to report unsubstantiated rumor, conjecture, has just gotten much lower than it ever was.
You've talked about ethics, you've talked about social media and journalism, and I guess my question to you is, how has social media, perhaps and maybe not, made the public relations industry more or less ethical?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with, too many examples that I can cite. I'd be hard pressed to cite too many examples of the public relations industry using social media in an unethical way. Although I'm sure, I don't think it's ethical, for instance, for a communications person to be writing the blog for the CEO. I think that's, first of all, I just think it's bad practice. But I also think there's a certain unethical aspect to it. Although I don't think there's, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with a communications person sitting down with the CEO, going over what they want to say or would want to put into a blog and coming up with something the CEO signs off on. But engaging in tweets back and forth where you're potentially posing as the CEO, or you're maintaining the CEO's Facebook page, or you're engaged in social media on behalf of someone else without really acknowledging that, I think is just fraught with peril. And I think it's bad practice, and I think it's potentially unethical in terms of it depending on how you approach it and what you're saying in it. And I think it's much easier to do those kinds of things now. It's much easier to insert yourself into a dialogue and to steer people, or to try and steer people one way or the other, where you're potentially posing as a housewife, an iron worker, or whatever, when you're a communications professional trying to steer a debate. I think it's too easy these days to hide behind a false identity, and the internet has made that possible. And I think that's always, like I said, bad practice and unethical.
You mentioned that you operate by a corporate ethics code,
Mm-hmm.
right? Does that ethics code, talk to me a little bit about that ethics code.
Tribune has had an ethics code going back decades. It is a code of conduct that all of our employees are required to read, know, and understand. The company itself has a set of values that guide our decision making, and those values get periodically reviewed to see if they need to be updated, to see if they need to be changed. The code of conduct at a certain level is something that the officers of the company and everybody, I believe, from manager on up, has to be trained in, has to do some online training, and has to physically acknowledge that they've done the training and have signed off on becoming familiar with the code. So we take it very seriously. And then on top of that, each of our individual business units, especially in our newsrooms, they have a separate code of ethics that governs the specifics of how they go about reporting, how they go about putting things in the newspaper, putting things online, et cetera. And all of those employees have to be familiar with the code, have to abide by the code, have to sign the code. So we approach it from several different standpoints. There's like I said, a code of conduct for your behavior, and there's a code of conduct that guides the actions of our reporters and editors and producers.
You think codes are effective?
I think the short answer is yes, I do. I think, though, that anybody that wants to act in an unethical fashion is not going to be deterred by the fact that there's a code that exists. But I do think that they have, above and beyond their effectiveness with an individual employee, I think they have a way of binding together the group itself in pursuit of a common goal or cause. And I think that's important. And I think that's what brings a sense of purpose, however loose it may be, to the group as a whole, and helps guide them. And for instance, in our code, you are as responsible for seeing someone else doing something unethical and reporting it as you are for monitoring your own conduct. So this is not just a matter of, well, I have to act in an ethical fashion. I have to report violations of the code that I observe. So I think it's effective in those ways.
Is there much difference in your mind, or should there be much difference between the code of ethics that a public relations practitioner might sign and that of a journalist? Well, we have two different codes. I mean, the journalist is going to sign a code of ethics that is promulgated by the newsroom. I'm going to sign, and he'll sign the company's code of ethics. I'm going to sign the company's code of ethics, and I'm going to be familiar with the company's code of ethics. I think the journalist has to be concerned about
and thinking about when he's going to grant somebody anonymity, how you're going to source a story, how many sources there need to be in a story for it to be credible, to be put online or in the newspaper. I think there are different things that govern each profession. There are certain commonalities. I mean, again, I would not want to be writing the CEO's blog, and posing as the CEO, or responding to questions that we might get from employees as the CEO. So I think there are certain commonalities, and same type of thing that would go on with a reporter.
What education and/or professional experience do you think best prepares a practitioner for the rigors of ethical decision making?
I think that the best training that people can get is to get a good education and to know how to write and to be what I would call a citizen of the world, and to be an active citizen of the world, so that you know about current events, you know about what's going on around you, what's going on in your community, you know what's going on in your state, in the larger community in which you're a player, and that you're able to speak conversantly about the important issues of the day. I think getting a good liberal arts education is important to help people frame their decision making. And then in terms of the decision making itself, I think you have to be, I think it helps to be surrounded by people who are living ethical professional lives, and to see the code of conduct that they're living by, that they're conducting their professional lives by, and to be associated with a firm or a company that has a code of conduct. I think it says something to walk into a firm and say, well, okay, what are the firm's values? What is this company's values? What's the mission statement? How do people relate to each other? I think all of those things help make the process of making ethical decisions easier and better for an individual if you can see around you others making similar decisions and how they go about doing it.
Have you, just want to ask you to talk a little bit about the ethical challenges that you might have faced in your career and that are part of your work?
From time to time, I've never been asked to lie. I've never represented a client that I didn't want to represent. I've never represented a client that I felt was doing bad things. I have, from time to time, on the private side, on the corporate side, you have to be a strong advocate for a communication strategy, but you also have to be willing to, I think, put yourself in the mindset of those running the business of which you're a part, and that you're willing to say, I've made the strongest argument I can make for why we ought to, for instance, tell our employees about something, why we ought to publicly say something about this as a company. And if others running the company at that stage are saying to you, I hear you, but we're not going to go down that path right now for business reasons. You have to be willing to understand that and understand why. And I'll give you an example. Back when Tribune Company was going through its strategic review of alternatives for a new business model, there was a lot of infighting on the company's board of directors. We knew that there were board members who were talking with the press in an effort to undermine the CEO and the chairman of the board at that time. We discussed whether we should publicly respond to those things that we knew had been leaked, whether we should publicly respond to those things that had been said. And I'm very fortunate to work at a company where one person's unethical behavior doesn't mean you answer it with similar unethical behavior. And it wasn't so much a dilemma for us because we had a code of doing things, and board dealings, board negotiations, board discussions stayed within the boardroom. And so we didn't comment on and we didn't respond to those things that were being said. And we probably, as a result, from an image standpoint, took a few hits, but I think everybody also felt better for at least having followed the company's code and made the ethically right decision on how to act during this situation. Because I think also when you start, it's very easy to peel back ethical behavior bit by bit by bit by bit, and a little bit here and a little bit there leads you to making easier decisions when you're faced with something that's clearly unethical, and you've said to yourself, well, we did that, we didn't do that, and we didn't do that, and well, now now I've compromised here and I've compromised a little bit there, so the next step is a fairly easy one to make. And I've never been in a situation where I've felt like that's been an issue for me at Tribune Company.
You've talked about working with folks in terms of improving their writing. You've talked a little bit about mentoring, and I guess my question is, can you mentor ethical decision making?
Oh, I think you can. I think that's what I said, what I meant earlier when I said I think you have to be around people who are modeling ethical behavior. And I think it begins with the youngest person on your staff. They have to see how decisions get made. It has to be somewhat transparent, and they have to believe in the ethics behind the decision that you're making. And it has to be within a consistent framework of ethical behavior. If you're constantly making decisions on a case-by-case basis, some of which kind of tread into the gray area, some of which aren't so gray, and some of which are just wrong, there's no consistency to it, and there's no consistency both of the decision-making or of the ethical nature or the ethical underpinnings of that decision. And so I think you can, you can help mentor younger people into making ethical decisions. You do it with an ethics code, a code of conduct, with values. It's not any one thing. It's a combination of things. It's values, codes, behavior, reinforcing those things. It's seeing how people who break the code are disciplined. All those things, I think, go into helping people make ethical decisions.
We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that I perhaps didn't ask you about that you were expecting to talk about, or anything that you want to add when we think about public relations and really public relations, values, and ethics?
Not that I think, I think the vast majority of public relations professionals act in an ethical fashion, have the best interests of their clients or their companies foremost in their mind, and I think that as a field, I'm proud to be a public relations professional, and I'm confident that the people that I'm working with are good, ethical people making good, ethical decisions. And that's true for the most part across the industry.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Very helpful, very informative.